And we are back with more News Talk Saga 960. So very glad that you could join us on the Mark Petroni Show. Well, Brenda Lucki is in a lot of hot water at the moment. She is focus of a devastating new story in the Halifax Examiner that claims that she basically interfered in a matter involving a mass murder in Nova Scotia, that she put in calls to the investigating officers in Halifax and asked for certain things that may have jeopardized that investigation. She was told at the time that it might jeopardize that investigation, that probe into the massacre, the 22 murders, and didn't seem to care that much about that because she was busy apparently pushing a political agenda on behalf of the Liberal government. If true, not only should she resign, she could potentially face an investigation herself. I want to bring in Paul Palango, who is the author of a brand new terrific book called 22 Murders, investigating the massacres, the cover-up, the obstruction, the obstacles to justice in Nova Scotia. And Paul comes to us from beautiful Chester, Nova Scotia. Welcome, Paul.
Good to be here, Mark. Thanks for contacting me.
Well, I'm glad that you could spend some time with us. Congratulations on your new book. And this book is doing extremely well. It's a national bestseller. We're going to get to that in a minute, but I want you to, if you wouldn't mind, address the issue of Brenda Lucki's apparent interference in this case. The story in the Halifax Examiner looks at what she did, making phone calls, pressure, using her position as commissioner of the RCMP, essentially to pressure the investigating officers to release information to the media about the guns that were used in the commission of this horrific crime in Nova Scotia. And she was told at the time by the investigating officers, well, we can't do that because it might jeopardize the investigation. She became miffed, according to the story, was annoyed, and eventually, I guess, had to accept the fact that this was not going to happen. But we're told that this was largely a political agenda that she was pushing on behalf of those who appointed her, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government of Canada. What do you make of this story?
I'm shocked, Mark. Absolutely shocked. I've
No, you're
written
not.
I've written 4 books basically outlining over the last 25 years the politicization of the RCMP. The story has largely been ignored by most Canadians, saying, "Oh, what's the matter? You know, they're political. The politicians must control the police." But now we're seeing the end results of that. In the Nova Scotia massacres, what I point out in my book is that the politicization is one of the problems that caused this terrible event to happen and unfold, because the police have ceased to be police per se, but political agents of the government. And Brenda Lucki herself was appointed a commissioner, the commissioner 3 years ago. She was far from the best candidate, but she was chosen because she told the prime minister that she would do things that were politically acceptable. She said that I would invoke restorative justice principles and do this and that and promote minorities and diversity in the RCMP, all the things that are politically acceptable but are contrary to good policing in Canada. And the last point, Mark, which should be the first point, these problems I've laid out from the beginning began in 1984 when the government used some trickery to gain control of the RCMP, and the RCMP commissioner was made at that time a deputy minister in the government, and had equivalent rank of a deputy minister, and was appointed by and served at the pleasure of the RCMP. So you're seeing the context for this right now, where the commissioner is doing the bidding of the prime minister in a horrific criminal case, and it's all blowing up now, and I'm glad to see that.
Let's listen to Conservative MP John Brassard asking who pressured RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki. So his take is there was somebody in government, possibly Bill Blair, maybe somebody else, who pressured Brenda Lucki into interfering in an active police investigation. Let's listen.
The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Mr. Speaker, there can be little doubt that there was political interference from the Prime Minister's office and the Public Safety Office, Minister's office, because of the handwritten notes by Darren Campbell, a superintendent panel in superintendent in the RCMP in Nova Scotia. In his notes, he wrote, "The Commissioner said she had promised the Minister of Public Safety and the Prime Minister's office that the RCMP would release this information. Release information in an active investigation that could have jeopardized the investigation." Who in the Prime Minister's office, who in the Public Safety Minister's office authorized Commissioner Lucki to speak to the RCMP?
The Honourable Minister for Emergency Preparedness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, the answer is no one. And secondly, perhaps the member opposite isn't aware that the Commissioner of the RCMP is the Commissioner of the RCMP and doesn't require any authorization from anyone else to speak to her own organization. But, Mr. Speaker, what is also clear, and the Commissioner has made very clear to the Mass Casualty Commission, is that no pressure, no direction, no orders were given by any member of this government to her in doing her job of running her organization.
Okay, so they're saying it wasn't us, but what we're getting from that story is that she did put pressure. Maybe she took it upon herself to do it, but clearly she was pushing a political agenda, because we know that the bodies weren't even cold before the government started pushing a mass, a culling of 1,500 long arms or firearms at the time. I think they either banned them or put them on some restricted list. I can't remember exactly what the rule was, but I think it was stunning at the time how quickly the government introduced this gun control agenda in the midst of that investigation. And so it makes sense, Paul, and I don't know if you agree with me that there was some kind of pressure put, because the government had this idea that what it wanted to do. It saw this opportunity in the form of this horrific event in Nova Scotia and seized that opportunity. And it needed, I guess, pressure put on those investigating officers to release information that they felt was pertinent in this case in terms of pushing a political agenda. I'm sorry if that sounded convoluted, but I think you get the idea of what I'm going after here.
Let me cut to the chase here, Mark.
Sure.
In my book, I clearly lay out exactly, step by step, how events happened in the first couple of days, because I thought they were important. I look at the press conferences, I look at the statements that were made, and all of this goes back to Prime Minister Trudeau. In the first and second comments he made on the two massacres in Nova Scotia, the first thing he said was, one of the first things he said was that the name of the gunman should not be uttered by the media, because we didn't want to sort of laud his infamy. Secondly, he talked about guns. And unfortunately, in the first editions of my book, that was edited out, and it's been reinstated in the third edition, which I'm very happy to say is doing very well. In 2 months, I'm already in the third edition. But I made sure that that was reinstated in the book, that Trudeau spoke about that on the first and second days. Those were his priorities. It was obvious to me that in writing a book before the Mass Casualty Commission came out, for me to boldly suggest that this was a cover-up, there are many sort of facets to the cover-up, but one of them is that the entire matter is being controlled, or was being controlled, by Bill Blair and the federal government. Both the composition of the MCC, the focus on restorative justice, which was totally inappropriate, but served the government's purpose in hiding the details of what happened. This all goes back to the federal government, to Bill Blair and Prime Minister Trudeau. I'm convinced of that based on the statements they've made and on the fallout for the last 2 years, what has happened. Because the last point on this is the Premier of Nova Scotia, both the current Premier and the previous Premiers, there's been 3 in the last 2 years, have each said there's not much we can do about this because the federal government is controlling everything. So that has to go back to Blair and Trudeau. And it's what's happening now is you're seeing this all starting to unravel because, as I said, I wrote a book saying there was a cover-up, and I've assiduously tried to disprove the cover-up. And the more I try to disprove it, more things come out proving that there's a multi-layered cover-up going on here, not only about what the agenda was of the federal government, but what actually happened on the ground.
What do you make of the fact that this information has been leaked right now? Do you see anything, I don't know, nefarious about it, or just the fact that all of a sudden this information is coming out that potentially ties Blair to Brenda Lucki to this pressure put on investigating officers to release information that, according to the investigating officers, might have jeopardized the investigation?
No, these documents are not leaks. They've been released as part of the Mass Casualty Commission's format, where they have massive amounts of documents that they release to the press. There's no sort of rhyme or reason to it. And this leak has come out. The Halifax Examiner did a very good job on it, but other media are reporting the same story. Maybe not in the detail that Tim Bousquet has done, but this is all coming out. It's part of the unraveling of this cover-up. On the other hand, you're seeing all the Mounties who were involved in this are sort of disappearing from the scene. I understand Campbell himself has sold his house in Halifax. The chief superintendent, Chris Leather, apparently is on his way out. Bergerman, the assistant commissioner, is gone. And a whole bunch of people in between are gone. And Lucki is next to go. I mean, the word on the street is she was away on vacation for the last couple of weeks, and that her tenure is over any day now. The problem again is that the government wants to appoint people that they can control, and Lucki was certainly one of those people that the Prime Minister thought he could control. He'd appointed a woman who had very little standing in operational matters inside the RCMP, was not well respected, but they thought, I'll appoint a woman there. And then Lucki, in her capacity over the last 3 years as commissioner, has done everything she can to please the Prime Minister, appointing women to and others to positions where they may or may not be qualified, but to fit a political agenda, to show that, and I say this, like I know that this is a controversial topic, but the RCMP can barely sustain 20% female members because of the horrors of being a female member in the RCMP. But fully, from what I can see, at least 50% of their leaders are females who have very little experience. So this is a political agenda that's being pushed by the commissioner on behalf of the government. And we've seen the end result of this in Nova Scotia with this horrific massacre, the cover-up, and the lack of ethics and morals on behalf of the RCMP members themselves, who've essentially abandoned ship. 70 Mounties took the summer off after this massacre on taxpayers' expense because they were stressed out. They did nothing to stop this guy over a 13-and-a-half-hour period. And this is the culture of the RCMP, the broken culture. And Brenda Lucki was at the head of this broken culture. The last thing I'd say about her is, in 2 years and 2 months since that massacre, Brenda Lucki did not have the courage or the sense to come to Nova Scotia and address the public.
What a disgrace.
Absolute disgrace.
I would go beyond that and suggest that in this particular case, if she used her position to interfere in a criminal investigation and potentially jeopardizing that investigation, that she could be subject to criminal investigation herself. I mean, if you look at obstruction of justice, ironically, she's the one who gave Justin Trudeau a pass for obstruction, of course, over the SNC Lavalin matter. He was never charged. The investigation was obviously a whitewash, even though Jody Wilson-Raybould had produced phone calls and produced evidence, smoking gun evidence, that would have warranted, I believe, charges if not to the Prime Minister himself, then certainly members of his little inner circle who all pressured her to making a decision that she didn't want to make. Yeah.
Mark, the problem is that you have Canadians don't appreciate how this politicization works. Now that the RCMP is not an independent force like it used to be prior to 1984, which was subject to the rule of law and to the very strictures that control policing in Canada. For political reasons, they were taken over. And as I've argued in previous books, it was bogus. And this is not the first investigation that Lucki is subject to. I mean, there's Project Eastbourne going on, OPP investigation in BC into the fallout and the behavior of the RCMP in the Duskansky case and the 4 Mounties being charged out there.
Right, in Vancouver.
That's ongoing. And you're seeing this incredible inability of the RCMP to deal with the power structure in Canada, mainly because of its politicization. You're seeing that an RCMP that is incapable of doing financial crime investigation has largely ceded that to the private sector. Meanwhile, they've botched the job as a contract police force in the provinces outside of Ontario and Quebec, where they're subsidized by Canadian taxpayers to provide this service.
Yeah,
it's just a crazy regime that needs to be addressed at the political level, and maybe this might start to bring it to a head.
Well, maybe Alberta will get rid of them. There's talk of provinces revisiting the idea that maybe they need their own force rather than having the RCMP. Paul, talk about your book. It's a terrific read. How do people access that book?
It's available everywhere. It's been #1 or in the top 10 in Canada since it came out. In the book, I really write 2 books. It's 600 pages. The first book is essentially the story of what happened. Second story, and the as the subtitle says, the epic failure in policing. The second part of the book I find is very interesting. It's the search for the truth and all the obstacles I meet, including the politicization of police and the politicization of the media. The media that refuses to cover the story and the details of the story, and who basically wrote me off as a conspiracy theorist, even though I provided all kinds of facts and details over the last 2 years and showed what is likely happened. And I'm continuing to do that. I mean, the book, and I've done it, Mark, I did it on something really unusual for a Canadian book. I made it really interesting and easy to read. And so people who have read
we all appreciate that, Paul.
I've had people compliment me from all over the country and in the States and elsewhere, saying they couldn't put it down and that they just couldn't believe what was going on.
Paul,
so,
thank you.
I'm happy about that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know our listeners really appreciate you coming on, and best of luck with your book.
Well, thank you. Maybe we should come back and talk about the media someday, because
listen,
a lot of insight on that.
I would love to talk about the media's role and the ongoing failure of the media to hold the government to account, in no small measure due to the fact that money from the government has been filtering to these organizations, and they've just been basically bought off. But that is for another time. So thank you, Paul. Take care. Continued success with 22 murders, investigating the massacres, cover-up, and obstacles to justice in Nova Scotia by Paul Palango.
Thank you, Mark. Anytime.
Thank you, sir. All right. That's it. Got to take a brief time out. Back with more on News Talk Saga 960 and the Mark Petrona Show after this.